We're going to have a longtime friend of the program back on, Dr. Dennis Lawrence Cuddy. He is author of many, many books, among them The Secret Records Revealed and The Globalists, which is a history of the move towards global elitism in the words of the people who did it. Just their speeches, their articles going all the way back to before the beginning of the 20th centuries. In 1890, Cecil Rhodes stated that he would start a movement that in 100 years would bring in a global government in which there would be no war and just one language. And this would be an Anglo-American dominated order of some sort or another. That was it. Well, here we are 100 years later, and there it is. So either this was chance, or there's been sort of a like-minded movement of people in various parts of governments around the world to bring this about over time, which is why you're seeing the regionalism going on. So how does all of this factor in with the history of the Middle East, which is really, I should tell you, Dr. Cuddy, by the way, got his Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was a senior associate with the U.S. Department of Education in Washington. He's been on a lot of radio and TV programs, written op-ed pieces for USA Today, been on things like CBS Night Watch, etc. In their words, Dr. Cuddy, Dennis, I call you Dennis, let's go back and trace the history of the thought of the use of the Middle East towards this global governance that Cecil Rhodes was talking about back prior to the beginning of the 20th century. As a matter of fact, the Rhodes scholarships were established to educate young men and women in the like-mindedness of this new Anglo-American dominated world order, as he was referring to it.
The general theory of all of this is that way back, and I won't spend much time on this, is during the 1800s there were various revolutionary movements. They had flowed out of the philosophy of the Illuminati, and basically it was to do away with all authority, and this wasn't just monarchical authority, it was any religious authority as well. At least that's the way it started. And then various people took it over for their own purposes, a couple of which were especially Giuseppe Mazzini, and then Albert Pike was involved as well. And the way those two hooked up is back in the 1840s, Mazzini was known as the point of light as the sun traversed the sky. And anyway, point of light is a reference that they've used not so much today except for George Bush, but back then you would find it used fairly often for some big change to occur. And of course, Albert Pike was into the same sort of thing. And so being revolutionaries, in Mazzini's case, he wanted to overthrow governments as well as religious. Pike was more into the religious new venue that they were going to take, which was wiping out established religious authority in God.
And when you said Illuminati, by the way, you're not talking about the way people loosely use that phrase today. We're talking about the original group, Adam Weishaupt and others, correct?
That's right.
The Illuminist thought is what we're talking about, coming out of the 1700s. Okay.
Yeah. Well, not only the thought, but there's like a track record. You have them, and once they were discovered, dispersed, going into the Parisian Outlaws League and then the League of the Just, which funded Karl Marx and his Communist Manifesto, and then they all hooked up together, Mazzini and Garibaldi and all of these people. And Pike, coming out of the Civil War, it was a Civil War general, he was involved in it as well. Make a long story short, there's this correspondence. Now, there's different versions. I've actually tracked down what really happened, and maybe that's another story sometime. But according to the accurate version, at least, there was to be this final war, and it was to be among the religions, and the religions were to beat each other up. And then when they were all exhausted and tired out, they would come to these types of people, Pike, and he said they will come to us for their pontiffs and their sovereigns and so on. So anyway, the goal was to have eventually this war, and so what I'm trying to do here is show how oftentimes what you have are these behind-the-scene movements that are bringing this about over a long period of time. And so what you would have in this case is the particular role of, as I call it, the role of Iran. And Iran is a big part of this, even going way, way back into the 1800s. And what you have, for example, today is an Iranian sect, which is largely dominant. They tell Ahmadinejad what to do, and what their attitude is that they want to have this conflict, and that conflict will bring back the Mahdi, who is the Muslim prophet who is supposed to appear before the end of the world.
The 12th Imam.
Right, the 12th Imam. And what he is, he's this part of this 12er sect, as they call it. And what they said is that the 12th Imam will be Muhammad ibn Hassan. Now, back in the 9th century, he's supposed to have gone into what they called occlusion when he was just 5 years old, but he's the one who's supposed to have come back. And it's supposed to be preceded by this cosmic chaos and bloodshed and war and so forth. And after this conflict between the forces of good and evil, as they said, he returns and there'll be this universal peace. Well, President Ahmadinejad reckons that that's going to be pretty soon. In other words, about 2 years from now. So that's why they're getting all heated about this. He's very close to a particular messianic sect called the Hojatiya Society, and that's governed by this, that this 12th Imam's return will be hastened by this chaos. And so they're, really interested in having this chaos. They don't mind it at all because, this is their religious fulfillment.
All right, let's do a station break. We're laying a foundation here for the streams of thought that have made up the current Middle East. Dr. Dennis Cuddy is with us right now, author of the book, The Globalists. I'm John Lefter. The program is Steel on Steel. Examination of the religious and philosophical factors that have come together to bring us where we are in the Middle East today from various sides. Goes back over 100 years. Dr. Dennis Cuddy, our guest right now. Welcome back into Steel on Steel. John Lefter here with you. We are examining, the confluence of thought, both of the global elitist type of thought started by Cecil Rhodes back in the 19th century, moving forward into the 20th century, the actions of the British and the Americans, the Anglo-American alliance, which ironically is what Cecil Rhodes envisioned, plus now the expectation, especially of people such as Ahmadinejad, for the imminent return of the Imam Mahdi, the 12th Imam.
In addition, one of the problems that we're having, the U.S. is having in Iraq today, is that part of this whole prophecy is that the Shiites will take control of this whole area. And that's why you see Muqtada al-Sadr with his, what he calls his Mahdi army. See, that's fulfilling it. And he literally believes they need to wipe out the Sunnis, because they're renegades, they're infidels, they've deserted the real Muslim faith. And, of course, the Sunnis don't want to be wiped out, so they're resisting, and this is why you have that sectarian conflict over there. But it's all part of this prophecy. It's not just, a matter of practicality, let's share oil revenues. This has a larger context. And if there is a war, let's say the U.S. or whoever, it's Iran, there's a plan. They have a plan in place. They'll send thousands of suicide bombers, into Iraq and destabilize that and the whole bit. But we'll get to that later maybe. The point is, behind the scenes, oftentimes you would have originally the British and then the U.S. sort of moving this thing along. And people say, why would we do that? Well, that's part of the overall plan. Back at the time that Albert Pike and Mazzini were cooking up this eventual conflagration, you had a young Cecil Rhodes in England, and he was listening to John Ruskin, who was his mentor at Oxford University. And basically, Ruskin had a swastika on his grave. It wasn't Nazi at the time. This is pre-Hitler. But it was this elitist concept. It was a symbol of elitism. Cecil Rhodes bought into this, the Anglo-Saxons, and we should run the world, and so forth and so on. And so he set up this secret society to take over the government of the whole world. Now, pretty soon after he started to gather his forces together, what happened is the people who would control British foreign affairs came out of his group. There were different parts of it, but basically they were associated with Rhodes. And in the late 1800s, he actually formally organized his secret society in 1891, but he was developing it even before then. What happened was the British started promoting a pan-Islamist movement, and it especially pertained to Iran. What you find is that the radical Islam of the Iranian mullahs today can actually trace its origins back through the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in Egypt, into the 1870s. And there's a book by Robert Dreyfus called The Devil's Game, in which he's explaining some of this, and he's saying from about the 1870s to the 1890s, there was an Iranian whose name was al-Afghani, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, but he was an Iranian, and he was supported by the United Kingdom. And this is 1870s to 1890s. And toward the end of that, he proposed in 1885 this idea of a British-led pan-Islamic alliance. And so India, of course, has its own intelligence,